How's it going, guys? I'm going to cover at least one or two new topics between now and coming back to school on January 4th, just because we lost those 3 weeks. But the date of the AP exams changed. So while technically we haven't been losing time because we had that extra time at the beginning of the year, I want to make sure that we are, really just staying with it. I apologize if there's any weird audio quality things because I'm trying to position the microphone in a way that I can still use the piano without trying to, if I have the microphone like kind of far away because if it's right on top of the piano, it blows your ears out. So with that, we're going to talk about a new thing. So we've been talking a lot about root position part writing, root position part writing analysis, all those kind of things, or circle of fifths progression. None of you guys have emailed me anything about the time I've recorded this video. But if you email me any questions you might have or review something you want covered again. But I want to talk about triads in first inversion, which really spices things up. So I have this also called why a 5 chord can be a 1 chord. So we have our first inversion triads. And obviously, as you remember, first inversion triads means that the third of the chord is becoming the bass note. So one of the one of the main functions of a first inversion triad is to extend one of our main tonal areas, either tonic, predominant, dominant area. So if we look at this, if you're following along in your books, so chapter 8, this is obviously example 8, 1, and 2. We have, using just root position chords, here the key of D major. Sorry, that's super loud. This bass line here, treble clef, D major, nice root position part writing. Nothing wrong with that. It's perfectly adequate. I'm not really going to try to play both parts at the same time, but if you're interested, the soprano part is. That bass line goes perfectly well with it. 1 chord, 5, 1, 1, 5, 1. We see that a lot, and then at the end, 2, 5, 1. But if you were to see that, would you take any issue with that? I mean, because that is perfectly acceptable, follows all of our part writing rules, the progression is fine. It's just kind of boring, right? It's just kind of boring. It's just no spice to it. That bass line, especially 3 repeated Ds right in a row. D, A, D, 1, 5, 1. It just isn't very exciting. We improved the contour of the bass line in example 8.2, the lower one, by adding in a couple first inversion triads, 3 first inversion triads, or first inversion chords in general. The second one's a 5, 6, 5 chord. But we improved the contour of the bass line by adding first inversion chords. So instead of having this boring, change it up a little bit. Still get 1 to 5, 1, 2, 5, 1. The 5 chord and the 5, 6 chord there in the middle in the second measure are essentially prolonging the tonic area because it's not a very strong, it goes from being a little bit stronger in the first one, that 5, 1 being a little bit stronger, to weakening it a bit by having that first inversion triad, or first inversion 7th chord. Remember I said before that any inverted triad, especially first inversion 5 chords, is not nearly as strong as its root position counterpart. So by inverting this to a 5, 6, 5 chord, we have made the 5 to 1 relationship, we've loosened it a little bit. It's not as strong if you compare it to this last much stronger, more final sounding 5, 7 to 1. So by making that 5 and the 5, 6, 5 chord essentially prolonging the tonic area, we make just a big 1, 2, 5, 1 progression, which is what we see all the time in music. So that's one of the main functions there of first inversion triads, prolonged areas of that. Another function that we see a lot is bass arpeggiation. You can see this example here. This is example 8.3. that we're looking at in the book. Uh, and we just see this, it allows for stepwise motion. You'll see a lot of, probably the most common first inversion triad or seven chord you're going to see is 5/6 or 5/6/5, just because it allows for very clean bass stepwise motion. So this one here that we're looking at, key A flat major. This bass line here. Bass arpeggiation going down to the 5/6. That's for just a nice smooth back up. We see this kind of stuff all the time. If you are analyzing a part, piece of music, and you see arpeggiation like this, it's just when it's 3 repeated chords or a bunch of repeated chords. You only need to write the Roman numeral the first time you see it, because it would just clutter things up. If instead of seeing 1 3 times in a row like that, and then 5/6, if you saw 1 1 1 5/6 1 1 1 1 1, it just looks cluttered. So you just do it the first time. When we're a bass arpeggiation or a bass line arpeggiation, the only note that matters for the analysis is the first note, or sorry, it's the bottom note. So we talked about before. Everything else above that, spacing wise, doesn't really matter as long as it's following the appropriate rules. But as long as you analyze the correct note as the bass note and write accordingly for root position, first inversion, second inversion, whatever, that's all you're really gonna need. But so we have this bass arpeggiation. We can reduce this down and just have a nice. So the arpeggiation just makes it a little bit more interesting, because while the reduced versions sounded nice, it just isn't nearly as interesting. I think it's definitely one of the biggest functions of a first inversion or any inverted chord, is just to spice things up a little bit. So when we are we're working with first inversion triads, the main functions I've said is improving the contour of the bass line, making it a little bit more interesting, increasing the variety of the bass line, making it, like I said, interesting. And then the other one I mentioned, if you remember, was the lessening the weight, decreasing the stability of that 5-1 that are not meant to be like very strong. Like we think of 5-1 as the end of a phrase, the end of a piece of music. A lot of times going to have that big 5-1, so do. If you want to have 5-1, or if a composer wanted to have 5-1 progression without it meaning to be like a very final sounding thing, if you invert it like a 5/6-1, it lessens the weight of that 5-1 motion, and that's one of the other big functions. You see that a couple times. Could ignore the thing about being 4 there. So a note about the tonal arrow. It's a lot of what we're talking about is tonal harmony from the tonal arrow. The diminished triad was pretty much always going to be used in first inversion. We see that still today, as diminished triad being a lot of times in first inversion. A lot of early composers really only considered any sonority, major, minor, diminished, whatever, to be acceptable if all of the intervals above the bass were consonant, meaning major or minor, no augmented or diminished intervals there. For diminished triads, this was only able to be used if you did first inversion, because if you think about it, a root position diminished triad has a diminished fifth between the root and the fifth, why we call it diminished triad. If we think about a second inversion triad, or second inversion diminished triad, the interval between the bass note, lowest note, which is the fifth of the chord, and the note immediately above it, which would be the root, is actually an augmented fourth. So we can't use that. But if you think about a first inversion triad, or first inversion diminished triad, the distance between the root and the top note, or sorry, not the root, the bass note and the note on top, which is the root, is a major sixth, and the distance between the third and the fifth is a minor third, because it's a diminished triad. So all of those intervals are consonants, so that's how we can think of it being acceptable to be used. One chord that we are pretty much never going to see in first inversion is the 6/6 chord. The progression that I have here, you can hear the difference between this root position 5 to root position 6 versus a root position 5 to a first inversion 6. It is not great because if we have a root position 6 chord, we have scale degree 6s in the bass. If we have a first inversion 6 chord, the root, or the tonic, sorry, is going to be in the bass, which can be a little bit confusing because usually when we have tonic in the bass, we're thinking a tonic triad or a tonic chord. So if we have a deceptive chord, which is perfectly acceptable, we talked about deceptive, progression a bunch of times. That's totally fine. If you're going to do it, then do it. But just listen, you can hear the difference between this 5 to root position 6 versus the 5 to first inversion 6. So here we're in the key of C major. And just think about the bass line first. It's perfectly acceptable. It sounds nice. If you just heard that bass line, you hear 1, 4, 5, 6. And then we would hear that 2, 5, 1, even though it's in first inversion. You could either hear 2, 5, 1 in first inversion with the 2 chord or 4, 5, 1. But it sounds like 5, 1, not like 5, 6. So if we throw in the upper voices here, you hear what I'm talking about here. Slow it down a little bit for myself. The 6 chord here, very clearly defined. That's definitely a deceptive progression between this 5 chord and the 6 chord. Move on. 2, 6. Sounds pretty good. Here we go. That sounds weird, right? That 5-1 motion in the bass seems more like it should go more like or something like that. But when we get this 5 to 6, 6 here, it just doesn't sound right. Having that in the bass, it sounds very strange. If we had instead made it a root position 6 chord going from 5 to this chord here, that sounds much better. But to go sounds weird. It sounds more like it wants to do like a 6 to 5 suspension. It's unstable. It doesn't really sound right. You can occasionally see it in moving between a root position 1 and a root position 2 because it avoids parallel fits. And it also may be used in sequential patterns, but in general, like I said, where you heard, it just sounds a little strange. So one of the last things I want to mention here is the idea of parallel sixth chords. If we see just like a series of chords in first inversion, one right after the other, we call them sixth chords. And you see this in a lot of tone music. These chords, if you see them one right after the other, you're going to notice that they are not really functioning in the way that a chord normally would. If you see a 4 chord, you're going to generally think it's a predominant functioning chord. But if you see it in a series of parallel 6 chords, it might not, and ultimately probably isn't going to be functioning as a predominant. 5 probably with 5, 6 would really function as dominant. You'll see why here in a second. If you look here, we have an example from a Haydn symphony. This highlighted area here, I don't know if you can see my cursor, is this series of parallel 6 chords: 5, 6, 4, 6, 3, 6, 2, 6, 1, 6, 7 diminished 6. As you can see, 5 goes directly to 4. That's kind of unusual. 4 going to 3 is really unusual. 3, 2, 1. It's just working its way backwards because the bass line is stepping down. They aren't functioning the way that a chord normally would. 5 normally would want to go to 1 or 6, then it goes to 4. 4 usually wants to go to either 2 or 5, instead it goes to 3. So it's strange. But since it's not really functioning as the way they're normally intended, a series of parallel 6 chord really is just meant to connect the chord at the beginning, just before the series of parallel 6, to the chord at the end. So in a way, if we're looking here between measures 4 to 7, 4, 5, 6, 7, yeah. We start with this one chord, this root position one chord before the 5, 6. This highlighted section really is just connecting it to this next one chord here at the end of measure 7. And that's really the function of what it's doing. If we reduce it down at the bottom here, let's play that key of D major. This is starting from the very beginning. So this first measure essentially is just one chord. Again, 5, 6, 5, 6, 5, sorry. And then we have this one chord. And then we have this series of parallel 6. Where here we are in measure 4. So measure 4. Move on to the 5, 6. We have this again series of parallel 6 chords here. We have this 7 minutes. And then we have this one chord. We got a nice 5 chord. That series of chords sounds nice, sounds perfectly acceptable, something we've heard probably a ton of times before if you really think about it. But those chords aren't functioning necessarily, it's just connecting. If you look at this textural reduction down there at the bottom, do you notice anything strange? Something that maybe goes against what we've talked about before, part writing wise? I just played the soprano, for the alto and the soprano lines from the 1, 2, 3, 4, 5th measure, and continuing on from there. It's just a series of parallel fifths, and that is unacceptable, usually by our part writing rules. But since this is a textural reduction, if you look back at the original piece higher above this, Haydn avoids this by offsetting the what would be parallel fifths by 1 beat. So instead, if you look here at the beginning of measure 5, we have an A to a D, which is a parallel fourth, totally fine moving to that 5th. So instead, it becomes a series of parallel fourths alternating off by 1 beat rather than a series of parallel fifths. So Haydn was smart by avoiding it like that. So when it comes to actually part writing using first inversion triads, all our standard voice leading procedures still apply. If you are part writing in 4 parts with first inversion triads, it is generally going to be complete chords throughout. If we have contrapuntal lines, meaning that the parts are relatively independent, the double note, because we have 4 voices, is going to be a double note, and only first inversion triads. The double note is going to be the one that results in the best voice leading, whatever makes sense when you're writing it out. In homophonic textures, meaning everything basically to be played at the same time, block chords, the double note should be the one that you think sounds the best, or you think will sound the best, and we still avoid doubling the leading tone. So when I say the one that sounds the best, we're talking about homophonic textures. Look at this example of 8/11 here. We have options for the double note. Usually an inner voice is going to be one of the voices that's doubled. Inner voice doubling soprano, doubling the bass, soprano and bass doubling, or the inner voices doubling themselves. We work from the right to the left is increasingly more common. So let's start with those what's the most common. It's inner voice doubling the soprano. Here, this is actually 1/6 chords in the key of C minor. So C minor. We start with this inner voice doubling the soprano. We may have something like this. Tenor voice doubles the soprano there, or maybe we have tenor voice again doubling the soprano, but just different notes. A little bit less common, but still see it, would be the inner voice doubling the bass. So we have, in this case, the tenor doubling the bass. Soprano and the alto doubling, a little bit less common. And probably our least common, not saying that it's necessarily incorrect, but the least common would be the inner voices doubling each other. In this case, the alto and the tenor doubling the C versus. Doesn't sound horrible to me, and to me it doesn't sound correct. It is just not what you usually do. But again, I would stick to it's fairly subjective, whatever you think would sound the best or whatever, as long as it works part writing wise, as long as you're not doubling a leading tone, creating parallel fifths, things like that. Go wild, do whatever you want. So 3-part textures also, if you're writing in first inversion chords, the chord will almost always be complete, but if you need to omit a chord, omit the 5th of the chord. So I think that's it, yeah. So if you have any questions, feel free to let me know. There's a bunch of examples in self-test 8.1, and also all the answers to those self-tests are in the back of the book. I think it's, I don't remember the page number, but it says it on there. There's in Appendix D. So do a couple of those examples, especially things that involve analysis, Roman numeral analysis, and a couple of part writing questions. If you want to send me some things that you've done, and I can take a look at them and provide feedback, or if you want, I can also just do a couple of examples and record those. I might just do that anyways. But yeah, do some practice. Like I said, we're gonna pick up where we leave off with these videos. So it is in your best interest to watch them and email me any questions you have. So have a good rest of your day, and I'll see you guys on January 4th.